I want to begin by telling you what I am not going to do in the next 30 minutes, because the framing of the question I have been asked to address is itself part of the problem, and serious analysis has to start by being honest about that. I am not going to tell you that the war is almost over. I am not going to tell you that the losses Russia took overnight, whatever their actual scale turns out to be once the figures stabilize, represent the decisive event that the more excitable corners of the commentary will claim. I am not going to participate in the cycle of declarations that this war has produced repeatedly, in which a single bad night for one side is treated as the inflection point, only for the inflection to fail to inflect, and the war to continue on its actual trajectory rather than on the trajectory the commentary had prescribed for it. The men and women fighting this war, on both sides, deserve more than that. And the institutions that will have to absorb the lessons of this war deserve more than that. And the public that is trying to understand what is actually happening deserves more than that. What I am going to do is tell you what almost certainly happened overnight, what it almost certainly means, and why the gap between what it means and what it will be claimed to mean is itself one of the most important variables in how this war is going to end. Because the question of when a long war ends is not the question most commentary treats it as. It is not the question of when one side runs out of soldiers or equipment or money. It is the question of when one side, or both sides, becomes convinced that the costs of continuing exceed the costs of stopping. And that conviction is shaped by the information environment around the war as much as by the conditions on the battlefield. The commentary that declares the war almost over after a bad night for one side is not a neutral observer of this process. It is a participant in it. And distinguishing what actually happened from what the commentary will say happened is the first discipline serious analysis requires. Let me describe what an overnight engagement of the kind that has produced these reports almost certainly looks like. Because the gap between what happens at the operational level and what gets reported in the public conversation is wider than most readers understand. A Russian formation operating in the Donbass or in the southern sector takes losses overnight that are, by the standards of this war, meaningful. The losses might be the result of a Ukrainian strike against a concentration that the Russian command had not properly dispersed. They might be the result of an assault operation that ran into prepared Ukrainian defensive fires and was caught at the point of maximum vulnerability. They might be the result of a logistics failure that left a unit exposed in conditions its commanders had not adequately accounted for. The specific cause matters at the tactical level, and analysts working with actual intelligence will sort it out across the coming days. What matters for the broader picture is that the engagement, whatever its specific shape, produced a casualty figure and an equipment loss figure that exceeded the rates this war has been producing on average, and that the figures, once they entered the information environment, were processed through the analytical frameworks that have been shaping public commentary on this war for nearly 3 years now. Those frameworks have a structural bias I want to name clearly. The frameworks reward escalation in their predictions. A commentator who declares that a bad night represents the beginning of Russian collapse will be read more, shared more, and remembered more than a commentator who declares that a bad night represents a bad night within a war that has produced many bad nights for both sides and will produce many more before it ends. The first commentator is making a more dramatic claim. The second commentator is making a more accurate one. The information environment around this war does not distinguish between drama and accuracy in the way that serious analysis requires, and the cumulative effect of 3 years of this dynamic has been to produce a public picture of the war that is meaningfully detached from the operational reality on the ground. I want to give you a sense of the operational reality, because the operational reality is what determines when wars end. And the operational reality has been remarkably stable across the period that the commentary has repeatedly declared to be on the verge of inflection. Russia has been taking losses across this war at rates that any Western military would consider unsustainable, and that the Russian military has been sustaining nonetheless. The mechanisms by which it has been sustaining them are not mysterious. Mobilization, both formal and informal, recruitment from prison populations and from economically distressed regions, continued reliance on conscription practices that produce manpower at rates exceeding the casualty consumption. Industrial output that, while operating under sanctions pressure, has been delivering equipment in volumes that have replaced lost vehicles and weapons at rates the commentary has repeatedly underestimated. None of this is to suggest that Russia is unconstrained. The constraints are real, they are growing, and they will eventually matter in ways that the operational picture will have to absorb. But the constraints have been growing for 3 years, and the war has continued for 3 years. And the rate at which the constraints are tightening is not the rate at which commentary about Russian collapse has been suggesting. Ukraine has been taking losses across this war at rates that are also unsustainable by Western standards, and that Ukraine has been sustaining through a combination of national mobilization, partner support, and the kind of national will that the Ukrainian people have demonstrated under circumstances that few populations have ever been asked to endure. The constraints on the Ukrainian side are different in their specifics, but comparable in their structural reality. Manpower availability is a real constraint that has been tightening across the campaign. Partner support is a real variable whose continued provision is shaped by political dynamics in donor countries that have been less reliable than the operational picture requires. Industrial capacity, while expanding impressively in domestic drone production and in selected munitions categories, remains dependent on imported systems and components whose supply is shaped by political decisions outside Ukrainian control. The honest picture of this war, the picture that the operational level reveals to anyone willing to read it without the filter of the dramatic frameworks, is a picture of two militaries operating at the limits of their respective sustainment systems, against each other on terrain whose specific features matter at the tactical level, but whose strategic significance is determined by political variables that the tactical level cannot itself resolve. The war will not end because one side has a bad night. The war will end when one side or both sides or the political coalition supporting them conclude that continuation is more costly than termination. And that conclusion is a political judgment shaped by many variables, of which the operational situation is one, but not the only. Now, let me address directly the specific framing that produced the question I have been asked. The phrase that the war is almost over has been used repeatedly across the past 3 years, by serious commentators and by less serious ones, in response to events of various scales. It was used in the opening weeks of the invasion, when initial Russian operational failures were read as indicators of imminent collapse. It was used during the Kharkiv counteroffensive in the autumn of the first year, when rapid Ukrainian gains were read as the beginning of the end. It was used during the Wagner mutiny, when internal Russian instability was read as the prelude to political collapse. It was used during periods of significant Russian casualty events that produced media cycles comparable to the one we are currently in. In every case, the prediction was wrong, not because the events being described were not real, but because the inference from the events to the conclusion of imminent termination required a chain of assumptions about how wars end that was not supported by the actual mechanics of how wars actually end. The mechanics of how wars actually end are worth describing with the precision they deserve, because the mechanics are what the commentary is generally getting wrong. Wars between major powers, or between a major power and a smaller power supported by major powers, end through one of a limited number of pathways. They end through one side achieving a military position so decisive that the other side accepts terms that reflect the imbalance. They end through one side or both sides exhausting the political will to continue and accepting terms that may not reflect the operational situation, but that reflect the political conditions in the supporting societies. They end through a negotiated settlement that incorporates the operational picture as one input, but reflects the broader interests of the negotiating parties as the determining variables. They end through the collapse of one side's political structure, which is rare and which usually requires conditions that are visible long before the collapse occurs. They almost never end through a single overnight event, however dramatic, because single overnight events do not, in themselves, change the fundamental variables that determine the war's continuation. The current war fits this pattern. The operational variables matter. They have been shifting across the campaign in ways that serious analysts have been tracking. The Russian forces have been performing better in some respects than the early commentary anticipated, and worse in others. The Ukrainian forces have been performing better in some respects than the early commentary anticipated, and have been constrained in others by factors that the commentary has consistently underweighted. The political variables on both sides and in the broader coalition supporting Ukraine have been shifting across the campaign in ways that will probably matter more for the war's eventual termination than any individual operational event. The economic variables on both sides have been shifting in ways that the commentary has alternately overstated and understated, depending on which direction the shifting has been moving. None of these variables, individually or collectively, has reached a state that would support the conclusion that the war is almost over. The variables that would support that conclusion would include things like a collapse of Russian internal political authority sufficient to produce a change in the war aims at the political level, a collapse of Ukrainian capacity to sustain the defensive effort at the operational level, a withdrawal of partner support sufficient to force Ukrainian terms acceptance under conditions of operational disadvantage, or a negotiated framework that the parties were prepared to accept. None of these conditions are present in the current picture, and none of them are likely to become present as a result of a single overnight event, however significant that event may be at the operational level. I want to address why the framing that the war is almost over keeps recurring despite its repeated failure to predict the war's actual trajectory, because the recurrence itself is informative about the information environment we are operating in. The framing recurs because it serves several functions for several constituencies. For supporters of Ukraine, the framing offers hope and motivation during a long war whose duration has tested the patience of supporting publics in ways that the early phase of the war did not. For critics of Russian conduct, the framing offers vindication of the moral judgment that Russian aggression should fail and should fail visibly. For media organizations covering the war, the framing offers narrative tension and audience engagement that more sober analysis does not provide. For political actors in supporting countries, the framing offers justification for continued support by suggesting that the support is producing decisive results rather than maintaining a stalemate. For political actors who oppose continued support, the inverse framing, that Russian victory is inevitable, serves a parallel function from the opposite direction. The framings are not neutral observations of the war's trajectory. They are participants in a political process around the war, and that process has its own dynamics that are not reducible to the operational picture. Serious analysis has to be honest about these dynamics because the analysis itself enters the information environment and contributes to it. An analyst who provides commentary that confirms whichever framing is currently dominant is participating in the dynamics of that framing rather than evaluating it. An analyst who provides commentary that contests dominant framings, when those framings are not supported by the evidence, is doing the harder work of maintaining the analytical discipline that serious assessment requires. The harder work is, in most cases, less rewarded in the short term and more important in the long term. The commentary that produced the prediction that the war would be over in weeks during the first year, and that has continued to produce variations on that prediction across the subsequent 2 years, has not paid an analytical price for its repeated incorrectness, because the information environment does not enforce accountability for predictions in the way that the institutions producing serious analysis attempt to do internally. Let me return to the overnight engagement that produced the question, and let me describe what serious analysis would do with it. Serious analysis would, first, establish what actually happened, which would require waiting for figures that are unlikely to be reliable in the first 24 hours after any major engagement, and that may not stabilize for several days or weeks. Initial figures are produced by sources with various incentives and varying access, and the gap between initial figures and final figures has been substantial across this war in many directions. Serious analysis would also establish, second, how the engagement compares to the baseline rates of casualty and equipment loss that have characterized the war across the campaign. A bad night for Russian forces, in the context of 3 years of bad nights and bad weeks and bad months, is meaningful only if it represents a departure from the established baseline rather than a continuation of it. The departure has to be significant enough and sustained enough to suggest that the underlying conditions producing the baseline have themselves changed. Serious analysis would establish, third, what specific operational mechanisms produce the engagement's outcome, because the mechanisms are what determine whether the outcome is repeatable or whether it represents a circumstance that the affected side can adjust to. A casualty event produced by a tactical surprise can be defended against once the surprise is understood. A casualty event produced by a systemic vulnerability is a more consequential indicator because the vulnerability will continue to be exploitable. Serious analysis would establish, fourth, what the affected side's response capacity is in terms of replacement of personnel and equipment, adaptation of doctrine to prevent recurrence, and absorption of the political and institutional consequences of the loss. The response capacity is what determines whether a bad night propagates into a worse week, or whether the affected side is able to stabilize and continue operations at sustainable rates. Serious analysis would establish, fifth, what the engagement implies about the broader operational picture, including whether it represents a shift in the balance of capabilities between the two sides, a shift in the doctrine being applied, a shift in the resources available to the engaged forces, or a circumstance that does not, in itself, reflect deeper changes. And serious analysis would establish, sixth, what the engagement implies for the political variables that will eventually determine when the war ends, which would require careful judgment about how the engagement is being processed in the political conversations of the major parties to the conflict and the supporting coalitions. None of this work can be done in the immediate aftermath of an overnight event. The work requires time, intelligence collection, and the kind of judgment that operates on a timeline different from the timeline of the news cycle. The commentary that declares the war almost over on the morning after a bad night for one side is not doing this work. It cannot be doing this work, because the work cannot be done that quickly. What it is doing is producing content that responds to the information environment's demand for content on a timeline that does not permit the analytical discipline that the question deserves. I want to be specific about what I expect to happen in the coming days, because the prediction will be testable and serious commentary should be willing to make testable predictions. The engagement that produced the question, whatever its specific shape, will turn out to have been a bad night within a war that will continue. The figures will stabilize at levels that are meaningful but not unprecedented within the campaign. The Russian command will respond with a kind of professional adjustment that the command has demonstrated repeatedly across this war, including the parts of this war where its performance has been less than competent. The Ukrainian command will exploit the engagement to whatever degree the operational situation permits, which will probably be modest rather than decisive, because the Ukrainian operational posture is constrained by its own resource and manpower limitations, regardless of how the Russian side performs. The war will continue. The commentary that predicted imminent termination will move on to other framings without acknowledging the failure of its prediction, because the information environment does not enforce that acknowledgement. The serious analysis that will be done on this engagement will be done over weeks and months, mostly in institutional settings rather than in public commentary, and its conclusions will inform the actual understanding of the war's trajectory, even though the conclusions will not be the ones that dominated the news cycle in the immediate aftermath. This is the pattern that is held across 3 years of this war. It is held because the underlying dynamics that produce the pattern have not changed, and they are not going to change as a result of any single overnight event, regardless of how the event is initially framed. The doctrinal lesson I want to leave you with, and it is a lesson that applies to the consumers of analysis as much as to the producers of it, is that the durability of a war is determined by the political and resource variables on each side, and those variables move on timelines that are longer and more stable than the news cycle suggests. A bad night for one side is meaningful at the operational level. It is not in itself an indicator of imminent termination. The indicators of imminent termination are different in kind from the indicators of a bad night, and confusing the two categories is one of the most common errors in commentary about ongoing wars. The two categories do eventually converge. A war that produces enough bad nights, sustained over enough time, against the sustainment system that has been declining at rates the operational picture reveals, will eventually reach the point where the bad nights are no longer absorbable. That point is reached when the variables that determine absorbability have shifted, and the shifting is gradual rather than sudden, and the recognition of the shifting requires the kind of patient observation that the news cycle does not reward. The question I am left with, and it is the question I want to leave you with, is not whether the war is almost over. The war is not almost over. The question is what you, as a consumer of commentary about this war, are going to do with the gap between the framings that the information environment is producing and the operational reality that the framings are obscuring. When the next dramatic framing arrives, and it will arrive, will you process it through the analytical discipline that the situation deserves, or will you participate in the cycle that has produced 3 years of repeatedly incorrect predictions about a war that has continued regardless of what the predictions have claimed? And if the answer to that question is uncomfortable, what does the discomfort tell you about how the information environment around major conflicts has come to function, and about what that function costs the public understanding of the events that the information environment is supposed to be illuminating?